Their wives, they wouldn't go into battle, but they were, it was their caste. They were also warriors. And it describes, how tall they were, how strong they were, and that, the Roman soldiers at that time were considered to be the best soldiers in the world. Well, so we have it. Yeah. And people like Strabo say that one of 20 soldiers would be no match for one of their wives, and when they describe the way they would fight, they would jump in the air and they would kick their legs in the air very fast and spin around. So what you see they're doing is that they're practicing martial arts, and just really, really fast. So one woman can just down 20 men, 20 soldiers, tough soldiers. So this is the whole point, that when people talk, this is why I say we can nail this, because when people do television documentaries and they talk about the Celts and the Celtic warriors being barbarians, they're not referring at all about, they're not speaking of it in the context, in its proper context, Indo-European, of the Indo-European hypothesis rather. So they're talking about them as if they're warriors that they're living in complete isolation. There's no relation between them and any other warriors in any other part of the world. But it must all be seen in the context of the Indo-European hypothesis. And that has been established. That has actually been established by different scholars in their various fields. Scholars who study religion, they call the gods of Europe Indo-European, and they call the gods of India Indo-European. So they're the same. And we see all the similarities, not only with Druids, but we see, like I say, with the warriors. They fought on chariots, and they would have up to 4 horses pulling the chariot. Usually 2, but up to 4. And they were very proud about their appearance. They had long hair, they had moustaches, they wore very beautiful clothes. They're very proud. And they gave their weapons personal names. They personalised everything. So if they had a weapon, it had a name. For a warrior to get a little bit fat would actually be against the law. Their waist was checked, and if their waist was found to be an inch, but beyond what it should be, they were given a fine. So they weren't. They had to. Their whole day was taken up in martial arts, in fitness. They had codes of honour. For one of the Celtic warriors, it was the last thing they wanted was to die of old age in bed. The highest thing for them was to die in battle. So they're very brave.
Right.
And they had all these codes that they lived by. So we see exactly the same thing. So, as I say, when they make television documentaries or write books about Celts and about warriors and how barbaric, and they're just not putting it in its proper context, because it has already been properly established by that the culture was Indo-European.
So, sorry, excuse me, is it okay if I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
So if I was to look at a book by Ninian Smart or a modern professor of religion, then I'd come across that term Indo-European.
Yes.
Right, okay.
Yes.
And that's coming from 20th century scholars.
Yes, 19th and 20th century.
Right. I'm not sure about the 19th. they're a bit sat in their armchair for me. I prefer the.
Well, this was first established by the European Indologists that were in India,
right.
the Sanskrit scholars.
Right.
They don't class Lord Indra. They don't class Shiva as an Indo-European deity, but they do class Krishna and Indra and those. Lord Shiva is considered to be Dravidian. It's part of the culture that existed in India before the Aryans went there.
Right.
So they've got this whole bogus division based on Aryan invasion myths. But all of the demigods, all of the gods that that exist in North India, they are all considered to be Indo-European gods. Just there are just so many things that there are so many things. Well, the reason I was saying that is because I was reading from a quote from a modern writer,
Right.
Peter Bereford Ellis, who's written many books on the Celts,
Okay.
and he mentions that point. He says that the Celts, to understand the Celts, or the similarities between Celts and Hindus, you have to see it in the context of the Indo-European hypothesis, because it's all connected. These cultures are all connected, and
So the Celtic image that's portrayed then in the media is a stereotype taken out of context.
there were no such people.
And doesn't.
Celt, the word Celt. There were no such people in history known as Celts.
Right.
It's a name which has been given since. It was a name that was actually applied in the 18th century by the British antiquarians.
Does that apply to Druid also? As a
Okay, well.
Would it still be something you've just been put in a pot, or would just leave it in the pot?
We're freeze up now.
The Druids.
Yeah. They say that the Druids came to Britain in the 3rd century or thereabouts, and so they couldn't have been the builders of the ancient monuments. And so, as I said, they call them proto-Druids. But this is complete speculation. In the bardic traditions of Wales, it describes bardism as being indigenous to the land of Britain, that it was taught by Hugh Gadan at the very beginning of time.
What does bard mean again?
Bard is Sanskrit. Bard means elevated. This word in Sanskrit has several meanings, but what I understand of bard is that it means elevated.
So the idea that Stonehenge was built by the Druids has been rejected in our
Oh yeah,
textbook
totally
history.
rejected.
But
Yeah.
from your research, have you found evidence that they actually did build it?
There's there's no evidence for it really. You can only look at the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that the bardic traditions of Britain are indigenous to the land. It says that all the way through it, that they were taught at the beginning of time by Hugh Gadan and Menu and such personalities. And there is actually no evidence that they arrived in the 3rd century. In fact, ideas like that were put forward by people like John Rees, who was a historian who lived at the end of the 19th century.
End of the 19th. This is roughly the same time as they were trying to debunk the Indian indigenous culture.
Yes,
also.
it's all part of the same thing. The Aryan invasion myth, where they hypothesise that the Vedic culture went from Persia to India, and then came out into Europe, and eventually came to England. It's just an explanation. It's just them trying to find an explanation to how do we have these features in our culture, in our ancient culture. How do we have Oriental, Asian, symbols and gods and traditions and etc. Actually, what happened? The way this happened is quite interesting because many Europeans started to learn Sanskrit in the 18th century. Started with Sir William Jones, and many of the people who worked for the East India Company while they were in India, they learned Sanskrit, and at first they were very impressed. People like Sir William Jones were just utterly amazed by Sanskrit, and during the Napoleonic Wars, there was a chap who worked for the East India Company who was on his way back to England. His name was Hamilton. I can't remember his first name. But anyway, he had worked for the East India Company in India. He was a Sanskrit scholar. And he was shipwrecked, captured and put in the Bastille. And sort of 1800, early 1800s. While he was in the Bastille, there was a German prisoner called George Schlegel. I think it was George Schlegel. Anyway, he was a young man, but he was a scholar. And while he was in there, he taught him Sanskrit. And so when he went back to Germany, he then taught others Sanskrit. This is in the very early 1800s. But he became so proficient that he was even able to translate Sanskrit, and he was quite this Schlegel. He was quite scholarly. But as a result, many German scholars learned Sanskrit, and it became so popular that they at Bonn University they opened a department for Sanskrit studies in at that time in the early 1800s. And when they started to study the Vedas, these German scholars, they started to see similarities between the things that are mentioned in the Vedas and the religious symbols and things in their own history, in their own culture and history and their archaeology and swastikas and all sorts of things. So they also understood that their language, German, had come from Sanskrit. So they're trying to give an explanation for it. How is this that our language comes from Sanskrit? And our gods match the gods of India, and we've got the same symbols, and we've got this, So they invented the Aryan invasion theory, just as a way of explaining these anomalies, basically. So this was then extended. The Aryan invasion theory was then extended to, Hinduism itself, that it was taken to India by Aryans from Persia, because these people, like Sir William Jones, who first learned Sanskrit, he was also a Persian. He was a linguistic scholar, but he also knew Persian, and so he saw similarities in Persian, between the languages, and so they weren't quite sure which way it was coming, if it was coming from Persian to Sanskrit and then or from Sanskrit to Persian, and they didn't quite figure it out. But they invented all of these in the 19th century. They invented all of these Aryan invasion theories into India and out of India, because they had no other way of explaining it. So in their mind, it could, these things could have only been here because they were brought by invaders. But they made up all the dates, because they've actually got no evidence at all for any Aryan invasions.
So could I just ask the question? Is a lot of this misrepresentation of history to do with Christians trying to make it fit within the context of the Bible? Basically a much older history.
Because they weren't really Christians. The German scholars, they loved the Vedas. They had the Bhagavad Gita translated into German. It was they had Upanishads translated into German. The German scholars went to India and collected every Sanskrit manuscript they could find. And even today, the Sanskrit department in Bonn University has got the largest collection of Sanskrit manuscripts in the world. But they really appreciated the Vedas. You've got people like Schopenhauer, he read the Upanishads, Nietzsche also, and Goethe. All of these people, they thought really highly of the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads. But they, scholars are always trying to find answers to questions, and so the question is there. How have we got these things in our country, in our culture? And so they, they're sort of building reputations on trying to find answers. But the idea of the Celtic migrations and the Druids coming in with the Celts in the 3rd century BC is just all part of that. All part of that thinking, all created by the same people. And John Rees, who was one of our British historians, who hypothesised that that Stonehenge couldn't have been built by the Druids. Although he was English, he studied at Bonn University, and so he's part of that school, where he thinks that everything has come from India through invasion or migration.
Okay.
But it's all coming from that source.
So now that all these misconceptions have come to light, it's quite clear what's taught through our education system isn't a correct version of history.
Yes.
How do you see the adjustment being made? Do you think our university scholars will admit, actually we had it wrong, it's now come to light, we've got the full picture now? Or do you think it will be a stage by stage
Stage by stage, step by step.
Well,